Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell, and I love Age of Empires. This game has been with me for over 20 years, and from a young age it inculcated within me a lifelong love of history that I still very much have with me today. As do I continue to occasionally play the game itself, even now 20 years later. As a small-time game dev myself, I often wonder what I would do if given unlimited resources and complete license to change the games that I love. What might I do differently? And while it's entirely a pipe dream, that doesn't stop me from trying. And as such, today I'd like to present to you a theory-crafted civilization idea I had for Age of Empires, that being the Georgians. These guys are an incredibly underrated and important civilization within the medieval Middle East, and I think they'd be a perfect shoe-in to the game as it exists now. I'm going to be keeping discussion of minute details to a minimum in this video. However, if you're interested in the more granular mechanical side of Age of Empires, please take a look at my civilization document in the description for a more comprehensive overview of my build for the Georgian. So let me give you a quick walkthrough of the build that I've drawn up here, and I'd love to hear down in the comments what you might do with the Georgians if you were given the ability to implement them in the game. Do you think that I was faithful to the history? And what might you have done differently? So a couple notes before we jump in. I am not a historian. I am simply enthusiastic and have access to the internet. Also, needless to say, everything I'm talking about here is entirely untested. I'm sure that many of my ideas would be completely unbalanced or unviable in practice, but again, that doesn't stop me from having a good time thinking about it. Additionally, as mentioned, I am a game dev, and to give a brief rundown of my approach to game design, I find great fulfillment and enjoyment in pushing the boundaries of what could be normally considered acceptable within a game, and my designs here reflect that. Additionally, I think it's very important in all games, but Age of Empires in particular, to increase the variety and make every single civilization feel different in the hands of the person piloting it. Familiar enough to be accessible, but unfamiliar enough to be exciting. So let me give you a brief breakdown of what the history of the Kingdom of Georgia looked like. It's a surprisingly long-lived empire that exists in this beautiful little nook right in the Caucasus Mountains. As mentioned, it is a fiercely Christian nation and has been for a very long time, and as such they had to fend off invasions from non-Christian forces on more than one occasion, almost always when immensely outnumbered. After the kingdom was formed by King David the Builder in the late 1000s AD-ish, the civilization entered a remarkable golden age, which I hope to reflect in some elements of my build that I'll discuss later on. They were also a player during the Crusades, actually able to shelter Crusader forces passing through to the Holy Land, and even getting involved in a few of the tussles and political maneuverings that were happening at the period. Moreover, the Byzantine Empire was on its last legs when Georgia was coming to power. So much so that the Kingdom of Georgia actually propped up the failing Byzantines as they were being ransacked by Turks and all manner of other invaders. Eventually, though, the kingdom's golden era was brought to an end by Tamerlane, as he did with so many other kingdoms. From what I read, he wasn't able to completely destroy the Georgians, but he was able to weaken them enough that they faded into relative obscurity over the next couple centuries. So as a point of interest, before they were Georgia, this area was known as the Kingdom of Iberia, confusingly enough. This is not the same Iberia as you see out on the Spanish peninsula, which is also called Iberia. We'll call it Eastern Iberia. And before that, they were actually the Kingdom of Colchis. If you know your mythology, you might be familiar with the fact that Jason and his Argonauts actually sailed to Colchis to recover the Golden Fleece. Besides those major players, the Georgians also contended with the Cumans on several occasions, who were, I believe, an ethnic minority within their kingdom and would frequently kind of migrate to and through their borders. They also made alliances, marriages, and I believe had a couple wars with the Slavs over a long period of time. They had to deal with the Persians, especially during, I believe, the Iberian era of their history. And of course the Huns, because everywhere in this part of the world had to deal with the Huns. So as you can see, the Georgians were a remarkably important player in this era of medieval history. They dealt with a lot of other civilizations and are in an incredibly strategic, important part of the northern Middle East. This gave me a lot to work with when I was going into their mechanics, especially when I started to kind of identify the major overarching themes that run through their history. The first one, of course, being their Christianity. They were profoundly devout people, but that did not stop them from being a remarkably religiously tolerant kingdom, especially for the Middle Ages. At one point, I believe they had not only Christians of multiple sects, but also Muslims, Jews, Zoroastrians, and a couple others all living in relative harmony within their borders, and I don't believe they even taxed them that badly. Don't quote me on that one, though. Similarly, they had a lot of different diasporae move within their borders during their golden age because of the promise of, money and success. And from everything that I can remember, they did a rather good job of integrating and treating these different ethnicities very well. Again, particularly considering the era and the location. Now, beyond just their Christianity, I also found a lot of sources remarking about the eliteness of the Georgian military. They were said to have just incredibly effective soldiery, and while being outnumbered on dozens of occasions, would pull off these brilliant victories seemingly out of nowhere. Now, there's probably a lot of reasons for this, but the one that kind of struck my eye as to their consistent successes were their strong rulers. There were very few stinkers among the Georgian lineup, and quite a number of screaming successes, again specifically shouting out David the Builder and Tamar the Great, who I'll go into detail on a little bit later. Either way, though, as you can see, there's a lot of great information here that I think plays perfectly into Age of Empires mechanics. Which brings us to the strengths of the Georgians in my build. First and foremost, the Georgians would have excellent monks, particularly because of their ability to construct a monastery in the feudal age. They would, however, be limited to one monk, and that monk could not collect relics until Castle Age. Additionally, they would have a civilization bonus, allowing for faster conversion of non-military units, villagers, monks, etc. This was my attempt to represent their ability to have an effective multi-ethnic and multi-religious society, despite being such profoundly devout and orthodox Christians. And lastly, they have another bonus wherein enemy monasteries are revealed the moment they are placed on the map. Once again, I'm trying to speak to their religious isolation in relevance to their locale here. I feel like it's important for them to know when they might have to be dealing with a potential contender on an ideological level, and this was the best way I could find to represent that within the game. One final note is that as their team bonus, the Georgians and all their allies will have units empowered whenever being healed by a monk, giving bonus attack and armor. I'm sounding like a broken record here, but this is once again trying to speak to their piety, as well as reference a handful of mentions to stories that I saw in which a moment of faith and clarity in a soldier or leader would help them turn the tide of battle. It's very hard to translate that to game mechanics, but I thought this could be a cool way of doing it, not to mention giving a really strong incentive to use the healing mechanic, which I find to be very underutilized in the game as of now. And for good reason. I think it sucks. Now, secondly, the Georgians' other main strength, following through from their trends that I noted in their history, would be their elite units. They have a civilization bonus wherein all of their Imperial Age unit upgrades are cheaper, representing, again, their dominance on the medieval battlefields of the Middle East. Additionally, they have a unique technology in the Castle Age called the Davitiuri, and this was a special sword crafted by David the Builder, the founder of medieval Georgia as we know it. This sword became standard issue for all soldiers within the army, and what it would do is it would allow gold-costing units an attack bonus against units of their class, so infantry bonus against infantry, cavalry versus cavalry, etc. With this technology, I was trying to represent the idea that a Georgian soldier could upstage any equivalent soldier from another civilization if they were pitted against one another in a fight, which did seem to be the common belief of at least the Christian and Muslim commanders of the region during that time period. And lastly, the Georgians would have a very complete tech tree for a number of powerhouse units, including champions, paladins, and a couple different types of siege. Moreover, their unique unit, the Tazreeli, would be an elite unit in its own right. Tazreeli here translates roughly to Templar or Crusader, if I understand correctly. And in this case, the Tazreeli would be a heavy cavalry unit, similar to a paladin, a little bit cheaper, but also distinctly weaker, not to mention slower. However, when within line of sight of a relic that wasn't controlled by the enemy, so anything that's just sitting there on the map that an ally owns, that you own, that's in a monastery, that's held by a monk, while one of your Tazreeli can see a relic, it becomes supercharged. Way better than a paladin. This gives you some incentive to actually tote a relic with you into battle, which I think is, first of all, super cool. Second of all, makes them great on defenses if you have relics in your base. And third of all, I think represents the Georgian fervor, especially within this sort of unit that's specifically geared towards a religious reconquest sort of vision. Now, though elite units and monks are definitely the Georgians' strong suits, they can do other things competently as well. For one, they have good defenses. Besides a relatively complete tech tree, they would also have access to a unique technology called the Hymns of Repentance. Now, historically, this was a poem that was penned by David the Builder, I believe, during a siege. And it was one of these, it led to one of those unbelievable moments in history where he and his hopelessly outnumbered army managed to drive off the Seljuks for, what, the fifth or sixth time? I can't even remember with all these Georgian invasions, man. But anyways, what Hymns of Repentance does in my implementation is it gives all units bonus healing when garrisoned, similar to the herbal medicine technology. Again, the vision here is that the unit goes in, they pray, and this restores them. However, the technology would make it such that all garrison healing lingers, not permanently, but for something like half a minute, once the unit leaves the building. Allow you to pop a unit in and out and retain a level of healing as it charges back into battle. Once again, I'm trying to appeal to the number of times this country was invaded, as well as speaking to their piety. I'm introducing all these fancy mechanics and strategies, but the Georgians also have some good bread and butter stuff as well. If you have ever played Age of Empires yourself, you will know that Castle Age crossbows are very powerful and allow you to hit a really good power spike right as you get from feudal to Castle Age. And in the Georgians' case, their Castle Age crossbows are great. They also obviously have an excellent night rush and stuff like that, but I thought that stuff was clear based on their former strengths. This one might not be as obvious. They do get thumb ring, by the way, which will make sure that their crossbows are firing at high speed. I thought it was fitting because that area of the Middle East does have a pretty good archery tradition, even if I didn't want the Georgians to have nearly as good archers as they do their other soldiery. Now on to weaknesses. In Age of Empires, elite-focused late-game civilizations are often very, very crippled in the early ages, and the Georgians are no exception. Their economy is unfortunately neutral, if not a little bit weak, because late-game they miss out on a couple of important technologies. This might seem like a nail in the coffin already. Economy is so important in Age of Empires, but I'm hoping that their other cutesy tricks, and especially their feudal age monk, help out with giving them a pseudo-economy boost to counteract their lack of, 25% better foraging or something ridiculous like that. Additionally, the Georgians would have some of the worst trash units in the game. For those who don't know, trash units in Age of Empires do not cost gold, making them really important late game when all the gold on the map has been mined. And in the Georgians' case, not only are they missing a couple of important upgrades, particularly on their archers, but they also don't get either halberdier or elite skirmisher. This means that once the gold runs out, you're going to be in trouble if you don't have your opponent in a very bad position. Lastly, once you get out of Castle Age, the Georgians' archers are subpar. Not only they're missing a couple of technologies, a couple of unit upgrades, just something to give them something they are bad at, despite all of their focus on elite. So what do I think the Georgians' playstyle would be? Even more than the other stuff I've been discussing, this is an especially theoretical element of my presentation here, but I'd like to touch upon it anyways, because it's fun to consider how a civilization built like this might actually look in the context of the game as we know it. Well, first of all, in the early game, you're probably going to be playing defensive, which does make sense based on the history. You'd mostly be protecting yourselves with walls or going for basic rushes. Once you hit Feudal Age, though, you do have access to that monk, and he can convert and is very good at converting villagers. This gives you an opportunity to actually steal a couple of your opponent's vills if you play smart and use them to offset a rush that you're already doing, allowing you to get kind of a fake economy bonus to boost you up into the mid-game, where you will hit your power spike. Not only do you have all these great elite units, you have knights, you have longswords, you have crossbows, you can push out of your base. The Davitiori tech will help if your enemy is trying to counter you. You have a built-in counter unit just with that technology. And you also have the ability to go for a very powerful, fast Imperial Age. The Georgians have an amazing power spike in early Imperial, and so if you have a good defense going on, you'll be able to churn out Imperial and then get the real power going, which is, again, reflective of their history. Once they hit their golden age, they started expanding their borders very substantially and became a major player during the Crusade. I should also note that I foresee the Georgians having a very rude castle drop. Between their elite units, their monk bonuses, and eventually the Hymns of Repentance technology, a castle plopped on top of the enemy is going to be very tough to get rid of in the hands of the Georgians. Now on to late game. As mentioned, you have an amazing early to mid Imperial Age, but once the gold starts to run out, you need to start getting worried, because they have an incredibly weak post-Imperial due to their terrible trash units. In my eyes, this sets the Georgians very precisely as a late mid-game civilization that needs to close things out before things hit post-Imp, but does a good job up until that point, minus the very early stages of the game before they can maybe get a feudal monk out. Now let's touch upon some of the other fun aspects of Age of Empires civilization building. The things that make the game beautiful, such as the architecture. They'd have a Central Asian architecture equivalent to things like the Tatars currently in the game, though I do like the idea of them having unique skins for the castle, a trend I'm seeing more often with new civs like the Poles, Bohemians, Burgundians, etc., as well as for the monastery. It strikes me as important to represent their Christianity in their monastery, even if they're normally using a Central Asian skin. Additionally, units would be speaking the Middle Georgian language, Gamar Joba, friends. That, unfortunately, is Modern Georgian, which I believe is somewhat similar to Middle Georgian, but it should give a rough goalpost for how I'm hoping the language sounds like, minus mispronunciations. Their wonder would be the Gelati Monastery, which was, I believe, constructed by David the Builder and remained an important site for the leadership of Georgia up until this very day. If I recall correctly, a president of Georgia was sworn in at the Gelati Monastery, but I could be making that up. Additionally, if the Georgians were to make it into the game, what campaigns might they have? Who might be their protagonist? Well, I have a couple of potential ideas. First of all, David the Builder, the man, the myth, the legend. This guy was cool as hell. He had tons of incredible strategic victories. He did a bunch of major social reforms. He kind of, if I understand correctly, he almost like separated church and state despite being profoundly religious himself. And as you can see, he's practically venerated as a saint in iconography. Super cool character. I'd love to see him in game. There is, however, a contender to his throne, namely Tamar the Great. This lady was the real frickin' deal. Not only did she fight just as many foes as he did, she fought off the Seljuks, she fought in the Crusades, she even outbid the other Crusader states to get a piece of the True Cross off of Saladin after he cheekily auctioned it. It's just great. She also was the one who was helping out the Byzantines when they were in the process of deteriorating to a smoldering pile of ash. Something interesting about Tamar, she was married twice. Her first husband was a Slavic prince. I forget what the second one was, but there was just this wonderful level of personal engagement in the story of Tamar, not to mention that despite being, of course, a woman, she actually had the title of king, not queen. That's pretty substantial, especially considering, again, Orthodox Christian nation, and this lady changed their history so much They continue to honor her to this day. Tamara the Great, you're beautiful. I love you. I'd love to see you in the game. I think that if I had to pick, she would be the one I'd want to see most as a Georgian protagonist. And as a final oddball option, rounding out the other two, we have Vakhtang I Gorgazali. This guy was a king during the Iberian era of Georgia, which could still be represented by the Georgian civ, of course. And he was this balance between Christian monarch and barbarian warlord. I believe his epithet actually translates to like the Wolf King or something, which is just cool as hell. He was an amazing archer. He launched aggressive campaigns against the Huns, and I think he eventually came into conflict with the Sassanid Persians, and cool battles against elephants in the mountains. What more do I have to say? And on top of a unique campaign of their own, the Georgians would also possibly be represented in some of the existing campaigns now. After a little bit of research and replaying, I could see places for them in the Saladin, Barbarossa, Tamerlane, and Kotian Khan campaigns, not to mention an appearance in the Manzikert historical battle. They wouldn't necessarily be nearly as prominent as some of the other civilizations that we have in the game. You know, the Franks are everywhere, the Slavs are everywhere, but even so, it would be great to see them integrated into some of the wonderful stories the game already has to offer. I am generally very pleased with my Georgian build, but there are still a number of lingering questions that I'd like to share with you. I'm worried about the feudal monk. The game designer in me sees that mechanic and thinks that it is just begging for exploitation, or it could even be garbage. Frankly, the entire civilization could be so weak that it is unplayable. Being focused on elite units in Age of Empires is usually a losing proposition unless you have very strong early game bonuses, and the Georgians don't. Lastly, the Georgians are an incredibly micro-intensive civilization based on the build that I have now. You're garrisoning guys in and out. You're clicking monks everywhere from feudal age onwards. You're having your champions fight only other infantry to get the Davitiori tech. There's a lot of very micromanagement intensive situations, and I could see that being, one, daunting for new players, and two, simply unfeasible in practice. Additionally, there were a handful of ideas I had while designing the civilization that didn't quite make it that nonetheless I'd like to share with you guys to give you a bit of insight into my design process, as well as to see some of the cool random nonsense that I came up with. I had this idea about buying relics. Again, the story of Tamar the Great, she outbid the other Crusaders to get a relic off of Saladin. And in an earlier build of the civilization, I had relics be a much bigger focus, so I figured, oh, what if your opponent gets all the relics? Then you're screwed. What if you can make one? Like, generate a relic. It would definitely have to be limited to one. But eventually, I sort of moved away from a profound relic focus. Additionally, I was toying around with the idea of various free monastery techs. Free technologies are such an easy way to give civilizations a kick in the pants, and before I had more specific ideas outlined for their religious-themed bonuses, I was considering things like free atonement and redemption to represent, again, their ability to have a multi-religious society, as well as being rather proselytic in their own respect. I was also at one point considering amping up the importance of their defense sub-theme, and one of the ways I thought about doing that was integrating the religious side once again by having monks being trainable at defensive structures, or even giving you free monks when you build such structures. They'd be like automatically garrisoned inside. But I felt again on balance that the religious ideas that I ended up implementing were both more interesting and more thematically appropriate to their particulars as a civilization. I also had a couple of other unique technology ideas, such as the Ruizi Urbnizi Synod, which was convened by David the Builder to again kind of subdivide the powers of the clergy. The idea I had for this was that villagers could drop off resources at monasteries and get some bonus out of it, but I ended up feeling like it wasn't a great link between mechanical implementation and history, so I decided to go with something else. Additionally, there is a Georgian holiday called Didgoroba, which represents and commemorates David the Builder's victory over the Seljuk Turks during the height of his reign. It was one of those battles he won against insurmountable odds. My idea for this one was that whenever you bring down a major enemy building, like a castle or a town center, every unit you'd have on the map would slowly heal up to half their hit points. I thought it was extremely cool. It's a very climactic and exciting technology, but it also felt super imbalanced to me, and like it would be either useless or overpowered. I don't really like win more mechanics when I can, though I could see maybe implementing something similar to this, maybe for another civilization. Lastly, the Tadreuli was not my only consideration for a unique unit. I knew I wanted a cavalryman, but I found this thing called the Monaspa, which was a noble cavalryman. You find those sort of things the worldwide, but in this particular case, they were a kind of minor noble cavalrymen, if I understand correctly, that could be conscripted rather quickly and efficiently to raise armies for Georgia in the face of invasion. So my idea in this case was that the Monaspa would be a unique heavy cavalry, more expensive than the Paladin and worse in some ways, but they'd get cheaper as you expanded your kingdom and built more castles and town centers. Similarly to Didgoroba, I thought that this might be imbalanced and win more, so I decided to go with the cool relic mechanic instead, but again, there could be a place in the world for this sort of mechanic. And that summarizes my build for the Georgians. Thank you so much for your time and attention. If you're an Age of Empires player, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how I implemented this civilization. Do you think it is a good fit with the game as it is now? Does it seem like it might belong? And how might you change my implementation to better fit your vision of the game and the history? If you're not an Age of Empires player, well, I hope the talk of history kept your attention. The Georgians are super cool and, again, super underrated, and I think more people should know about them. And that's one of the beautiful things about games like Age of Empires. They expand the purview of history to people who might otherwise have had no interest, like little 7-year-old Rob way back 20 years ago. As always, my name is Robbie Howell, and ciao for now.